All right, this is Honors Algebra 2 Pre-Calculus. We're doing section 9.7 in Pre-Calc, which is probability. So let's do a little bit of vocab first. Any happening for which the result is uncertain is called an experiment, right? So an easy example of this is I flip a coin, right? When I flip a coin, it could land on heads or tails. So the outcome is uncertain. That's called an experiment. The possible results of this experiment are called outcomes. So in that analogy, one outcome would be heads, the other outcome would be tails. The list of all the outcomes for an experiment is called the sample space. So in that situation, the example I just described, the sample space would be heads, comma, tails, right? So if I just inch this over for a sec, so an example of an experiment is I flip a coin, right? That's an example of an experiment, right? The possible outcomes of the experiment would be heads or tails, right? Those would be the possible outcomes, right? A list of the sample space, which we're going to call S, gets these braces, which are like the squiggly brackets, H, comma, T, right? Those are the two outcomes of me flipping my coin. That's called the sample space. Any sub-collection of the sample space, right? Any sub-collection of that is called an event. So for instance, if I were asking for the sub-collection where I flip heads, the sub-collection would literally just be H. That's it, the event where I flip heads, right? Not the whole thing. Now, that's not a great example because there were only two outcomes here, but we're going to do other examples of this in a sec. So let's start with example 1. Let's find the sample space of, and for A, we're going to talk about flipping a coin twice. Now, you can figure this out by drawing a tree diagram if that's helpful to you, or you can just kind of go through the list in your head, right? So the sample space for flipping a coin twice is going to be S equals, and then I put that brace, that squiggly bracket, right? So I could flip heads, and then heads again, right? Because I'm flipping a coin twice, heads, heads. I could have flipped heads first and then flipped tails, right? That's pretty much exhausting my options for what happens if I flip heads first. I could also have flipped tails first and heads, or I could flip tails, tails, right? So that's my sample space for this particular situation, flipping a coin twice. Heads, 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 tails, tails, heads, tails, tails. Doesn't matter what order I write them in, those are the 4 possible outcomes. You can actually figure out that it's 4 outcomes using that fundamental counting principle that we learned in 9.6, because there were 2 options for my first flip, right? 2 options, I could either get heads or tails, and then on the second flip, I could either get heads or tails. So look, it is not surprising that there are 4 possible outcomes, right? And that's exactly what I got here. Sample space for flipping a coin and rolling a die, right? Well, that sample space, which I'm going to do my S and then write my squiggly bracket, I'm going to flip the coin, and it's going to either be heads or tails. So I get heads, and I could roll and get a 1. Right, we're assuming I mean a typical 6-sided die, right? Heads and a 2, heads and a 3, heads and a 4, heads and a 5, or heads and a 6, right? I could also have flipped tails, tails and a 1, tails and a 2, tails and a 3, tails and a 4, tails and a 5, tails and a 6. So there are 12 elements in my sample space here, right? There are 12 possible outcomes. And again, you could figure that out, the number 12, you could figure out by doing the fundamental counting principle. There were 2 ways I could flip the coin. There are 6 ways I can roll the die. Oh, look, it is not a surprise that there are 12 possible outcomes. Now, when we talk about an event, when we look at these larger sample spaces, I could say, for instance, in A, where I was flipping a coin twice, my event could be that I flip the same thing both times. Well, that would consist only of heads, heads, and tails, tails. It wouldn't consist of the other 2. So an event is some subspace of this that is some other specific outcome within the list of other outcomes. So again, for A, my event that I could be describing could be flipping the same thing twice, heads, heads, and tails, tails. Or for B, flipping a coin and rolling a die, maybe my event is if I get heads and a prime number, right? Which would be H2, because that's heads and 2 is prime. H3, because 3 is also prime. And H5, because 5 is also prime. And those are the only 3 outcomes out of the total 12 that would meet the guidelines for that event.